In 1963, a grandmother in Macon, Georgia fed 7 grandchildren breakfast every morning for under 40 cents. She used 3 ingredients that did not change: cornmeal, lard, and whatever the garden gave her. That breakfast is number 12 on this list. Number 18 cost less than a dime. Number 7 was the breakfast every black family on the Carolina coast ate before church, and now almost nobody remembers it. Your grandmother used to make it. Now, I am not a doctor, and I am not telling you to change how you eat. This is just looking at how things used to be. These 25 breakfasts kept black families fed during the hardest decade of the civil rights era. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 quick soul food breakfasts from the 1960s for seniors on a budget. Number 25, 1 egg stretched 5 ways. In a household where 7 people needed breakfast and the icebox held 3 eggs, a mother in Birmingham cracked 1 egg into leftover rice, stirred it through, then fried the whole thing in bacon grease until the rice turned golden and the egg disappeared into every grain. Other mothers scrambled 1 egg into a pot of grits, letting the heat set it into thin ribbons of protein hiding in plain sight. Some beat an egg into flour and water to make a thin pancake that covered a plate and fooled a child into thinking they had gotten their fair share. In 1962, a dozen eggs cost 54 cents. Each egg was less than 5 cents. 5 cents between a child eating protein and a child eating nothing. Generations of black mothers did not have cookbooks for this. They had arithmetic and love, and those 2 things could make 1 egg feel like a feast. Number 24, coffee-soaked bread. A cup of black coffee and a heel of day-old bread. You tore the bread into pieces, dropped them into the coffee, added a spoonful of sugar, and ate it with a spoon-like soup. In the Mississippi Delta, this was called SOP. In parts of Alabama, they called it coffee, bread. The coffee softened the bread into something porridge-like, warm and caffeinated enough to get a person moving back then. A pound of coffee cost 75 cents in 1964. A loaf of bread was 21 cents. Together, a week of breakfast for under $1. Nobody was proud of this recipe, but thousands of elderly black men and women ate this alone in quiet kitchens across the South, and they never told their children because admitting you ate bread soaked in coffee felt like admitting something larger about your life. Number 23, crackling bread. When a hog was slaughtered, the skin was cut into pieces and rendered until the fat melted and the skin turned into crunchy golden bits called cracklings. Those cracklings went straight into cornbread batter. The result was bread that crackled when you bit into it, rich with pork flavor and studded with crispy morsels. A pan of crackling bread could sit on the counter for 3 days and still taste good. In rural Georgia and the Carolinas, crackling bread with a glass of buttermilk was the traditional breakfast, and it did not need anything else. The cost was nothing because the cracklings were a byproduct of making lard, which was itself a byproduct of the hog already paid for. The hog gave meat for the smokehouse, fat for the lard bucket, and cracklings for the bread. Nothing went to waste because nothing could afford to. Number 22, sweet potato pone. Not a pie and not a casserole. Something in between with no modern equivalent. You grated raw sweet potatoes until your knuckles ached, mixed the pulp with molasses, buttermilk, cinnamon, and lard, then poured it into a greased pan and baked it low and slow until the top turned dark and caramelized. The texture was dense and chewy, almost like pudding that decided to become bread. Sweet potatoes were the cheapest vegetable in the 1960s South. A bushel cost less than $1 at roadside stands. Grandmothers who grew their own paid nothing. They baked pone in the evening, when the oven was already hot from supper, wrapped it in cloth, and set it on the counter for morning. A slice with coffee was a full breakfast, sweet enough to feel like a treat, substantial enough to carry a person through 4 hours of work. Number 21, sawmill gravy and biscuits. The name came from lumber camps, where cooks fed crews for pennies. You rendered salt pork in a skillet, stirred flour into the drippings until golden, then poured in milk and scraped the bottom until it thickened into a pale, peppery gravy. Pour that over a split biscuit, and you had breakfast that stuck to your ribs until supper. In black households across the rural South, sawmill gravy was the breakfast that appeared when there was not any meat for the plate. The gravy was the meat course, flavored with drippings that gave it a richness disguising how little pork was involved. Grandmothers had been making biscuits by feel for decades, cutting lard into flour with their fingers, adding buttermilk until the dough felt right. Biscuits in 12 minutes, gravy in 8, a full breakfast for 5 people, less than 30 cents. Number 20, fried green tomatoes. Long before Hollywood turned the name into a movie, fried green tomatoes were a workday breakfast. When the garden produced more than a family could eat and frost was coming, mothers picked them green and sliced them thick. Each slice got dredged in cornmeal, then fried in bacon grease until crispy outside and soft inside. The contrast was the whole point. Crunchy coating, almost creamy tomato with a tartness that cut through the richness. A plate of fried green tomatoes with a biscuit and coffee cost nothing because the tomatoes came from the yard the way they used to in every household, and the cornmeal was already in the cupboard. Black families across Alabama and Mississippi made this 3 or 4 times a week during tomato season. Nobody photographed it. Nobody wrote it down. It was August, the tomatoes weren't ripe, and breakfast needed to happen. Number 19, blackstrap molasses milk. A tall glass of cold milk with 2 tablespoons of blackstrap molasses stirred until it turned dark and sweet. Mothers called it a tonic. Grandmothers said it built strong blood. They were not wrong. Blackstrap molasses contains more iron per tablespoon than a serving of spinach, and in communities where anemia was common and doctor visits rare, a glass every morning was folk medicine that worked. A jar of grandma's molasses cost 35 cents in 1965. Combined with milk at 49 cents a half gallon, 2 weeks of morning drinks for under $1. Children drank it cold in summer, warm in winter. Some mothers added a raw egg and shook it like a milkshake. The taste was dark and mineral, almost like coffee for a child. No one calls it a superfood. No one puts it on a menu. But the iron it delivered kept black children standing in classrooms where they were not always welcome. Number 18, sugar bread. A slice of white bread, a smear of butter or margarine, a heavy sprinkle of sugar. That was it. A mother folded the bread in half so the sugar would not fall out and handed it to a child on the way out the door. A loaf cost 21 cents. Sugar cost a dime. Margarine was 25 cents a pound, less than a dime per serving. This was not nutrition. This was a promise. A mother saying, I could not give you eggs this morning, but I can give you something sweet enough to make you forget that. In black neighborhoods of Memphis, Detroit, and Chicago, sugar bread was the breakfast of the Great Migration. Families who had moved north for factory jobs still ate it on payday mornings, long after they could afford something better, because some foods passed down through hard times carry more than calories. They carry the memory of when you could not afford anything else. Here is something that does not get said enough. The women who made these breakfasts were not cooking. They were engineering. They had a budget that was fixed, mouths that were not, and a clock that gave them 20 minutes between waking up and getting a child out the door. Every ingredient had to justify its place. Every penny had to stretch. Every plate had to look full enough that a child did not go to school feeling poor. These were not recipes born from creativity. They were born from mathematics in kitchens that were too hot in summer and too cold in winter by women who had already been awake for an hour doing someone else's laundry. The breakfasts on this list are not nostalgia. They are evidence that Black women in the 1960s fed families on budgets that should not have been survivable. Number 17, fatback and fried apples. In the mountains of Virginia and the Carolinas, fatback and fried apples was a fall breakfast that cost almost nothing. You sliced fatback thin and fried it until the fat rendered. Then you dropped sliced apples into the same hot grease. The apples sizzled and softened, soaking up the pork flavor and caramelizing. A sprinkle of cinnamon if you had it. The plate was sweet and salty and rich, done in under 10 minutes. Apples cost 15 cents a pound in 1963. Fatback was cheaper because nobody else wanted it. The white strips of pure pork fat were what the butcher sold last, often for pennies because affluent customers had moved on to bacon. Black families and poor Appalachian families bought what was left and turned it into breakfast. Number 16, smothered potatoes with onions. 3 potatoes, 1 onion, a tablespoon of lard, salt and pepper, a skillet, and a lid. You sliced everything thin and fried it together with the lid on until the potatoes turned soft and golden and the onions dissolved into a sweet, sticky tangle. The lid trapped steam and turned the skillet into a little oven. 15 minutes and it fed 2 people generously or 3 adequately. Potatoes cost 6 cents a pound. Onions were a nickel. Total cost, less than 20 cents. In households across the south side of Chicago and the west end of Louisville, smothered potatoes appeared every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Tuesday and Thursday were grits. Weekend was biscuits. That rotation lasted years in families where the budget never changed. Here's what that meant. Number 15, tomato gravy over biscuits. Not tomato sauce, tomato gravy. You started with bacon drippings in a skillet, added flour, and stirred until it browned, then poured in a can of stewed tomatoes and let it simmer until it thickened into a chunky, savory gravy, somehow both sweet and smoky. Pour it over a split biscuit and you had a breakfast that tasted like a southern garden and a smokehouse having a conversation. This was a staple in Black households across Alabama and Mississippi, especially in months when canned tomatoes were the only fruit in the cupboard. A can cost 12 cents. The drippings and flour were already there. For a senior on a fixed income, this required almost no shopping and used ingredients that kept for months. Modern food writers call it a forgotten classic. It was never forgotten by the people who needed it. Number 14, spoon bread. Edna Lewis, the legendary Black chef from Freetown, Virginia, wrote about loving spoon bread as a child. It wasn't bread at all, but a souffle made from cornmeal, milk, and butter, eggs beaten until light and baked until it puffed golden and trembling. You ate it with the spoon because it was too soft to slice. In the 1960s, spoon bread was a Sunday morning dish in Virginia and the Piedmont. It required more eggs than most breakfasts, making it special. But seniors who kept chickens had eggs every day, and for them, spoon bread was an ordinary Tuesday. Cornmeal cost pennies. Eggs came from the yard. The technique was everything. You had to beat the batter long enough to incorporate air and know your oven well enough to pull it at the right moment. Grandmothers who made spoon bread never wrote the recipe down because the recipe was in their hands. Number 13, liver and onions. Before cholesterol became a word ordinary people knew, liver and onions was a Tuesday morning breakfast. You sliced liver thin, dredged it in seasoned flour, and fried it with onions until the liver was just cooked and the onions turned sweet. Doctors in the 1960s recommended liver for anemia, which disproportionately affected Black women and children. A pound of beef liver cost 39 cents in 1965, cheaper than almost every other cut. The taste was strong, almost metallic, and children either loved it or gagged. No middle ground, but the iron content was extraordinary. A single serving delivered more than a full day's requirement. For a senior woman on Social Security, liver twice a week was the difference between energy and exhaustion. Nobody prescribed it. Nobody called it a supplement. Grandmothers just knew. Here is what the grocery industry understood about Black families in the 1960s and never said out loud. The foods that kept these families alive had the lowest profit margins: cornmeal, dried beans, fatback, molasses, potatoes. You cannot build a brand around a 5-pound bag of cornmeal. You cannot run a television commercial for fatback. There is no jingle for Potlikker. So the industry replaced these foods with processed alternatives that cost more and delivered less. Instant grits replaced stone ground. Margarine replaced lard. Canned biscuits replaced handmade. Cornflakes replaced cornmeal mush. Each replacement was marketed as progress, but the processed breakfast cost more and left you hungrier by 10 in the morning. The women who cooked these breakfasts were not old-fashioned. They were efficient, and the market punished efficiency because there was no money in it. And number 12, fried cornmeal mush. Cornmeal cooked in water until it thickened into porridge. That was mush. Fried cornmeal mush was the leftovers. You poured hot mush into a loaf pan and let it set overnight until it firmed into a solid block. Morning, you sliced it 1/2 inch thick and fried each slice in bacon grease until both sides turned crispy. Inside, it stayed soft and creamy. You ate it with molasses poured over the top. A 5-pound bag of cornmeal cost 29 cents in 1963 and made breakfast for 6 people for 2 weeks. The grandmother in Macon, who fed 7 grandchildren on 40 cents a day, kept a loaf pan of set mush in the icebox at all times. When the grandchildren came, she sliced and fried. When they didn't come, she ate it herself at the same table where she once fed a husband and 9 children. The mush didn't change. The number of people at the table did. Number 11, scrambled eggs and brains. On hog-killing mornings in rural Alabama and Mississippi, the most perishable organs hit the table first. Brains could not be salted or smoked. They had to be eaten immediately. A grandmother rinsed the brains, removed the membrane, then scrambled them with eggs and butter until the mixture turned creamy and custard-like. The texture was softer than regular eggs, almost velvety. Children who ate it called it special eggs and did not know what was in them until years later. By then, they already loved the taste. The brains came free with the hog. The eggs came from the hen house. Total cost was $0. This breakfast has vanished. The last generation to eat it regularly is in their 70s and 80s now. When they go, the taste goes with them. Number 10, Potlikker and cornbread. Potlikker was the liquid left behind after cooking collard greens, turnip greens, or mustard greens. Dark, rich, loaded with vitamins that had leached out during hours of slow cooking. Nobody threw it away. Morning, your grandmother reheated last night's Potlikker, crumbled leftover cornbread into a bowl, and poured the warm broth over it. The cornbread absorbed the liquid and turned into something like savory bread pudding, eaten with a spoon at the kitchen table, usually in silence. This was not a social meal. This was fuel. The entire breakfast was made from leftovers that most modern Americans would pour down the drain. The potlikker was free. The cornbread was already made. In black households, potlikker was considered medicinal. Mothers gave it to sick children. Grandmothers drank a cup every morning the way other people drink juice. The vitamins are real. The iron is real. Number 9, leftover rice and gravy. Who taught you that last night's rice could become breakfast? In the low country of South Carolina and Creole kitchens of Louisiana, rice wasn't a side dish. It was the foundation. Leftover rice went into a skillet the next morning with a ladle of gravy, brown gravy from smothered pork chops, tomato gravy from stewed chicken, or just pan drippings saved in a jar by the stove. You heated it until the rice absorbed the gravy and each grain was coated. A plate with a biscuit on the side was breakfast that cost nothing because everything had been paid for the day before. In the Gullah communities of the Sea Islands, rice and gravy for breakfast was so traditional, so common, that not having it felt wrong. The rice was always there because the rice was always left over, because no one in a Gullah kitchen ever cooked less than a full pot. Number 8, streakoline and eggs. Streakoline was the poor family's bacon, a slab of salt-cured pork belly with a thin streak of lean running through fat. Sliced thin and fried until crisp, the grease left behind fried the eggs. Bacon cost 79 cents a pound in 1964. Streakoline cost 35. For a family of 5, that difference meant the children ate protein or they didn't. Nobody chose streakoline because they preferred it. The budget chose for them. The taste was saltier and fattier than bacon, chewier, requiring more jaw work. But fried until crisp next to 2 eggs, cooked in its own grease, it delivered more calories per penny than almost anything in the store. Butchers kept streakoline behind the counter because it did not sell itself. You had to ask for it, and the people who asked knew exactly what it meant to need it. Here is what nobody says about these breakfasts. They were fast. Every single one could be made in under 15 minutes. That matters because the women making them were not leisurely cooks. They were women who woke at 4:30 to cook for their own families before leaving to cook in someone else's house. Women who worked night shifts and had 20 minutes between getting home and getting children off to school. Women who were 70 and standing on swollen ankles because sitting down felt like giving up. A breakfast that took 30 minutes did not get made. A breakfast requiring 4 pans left too much to wash. These meals used 1 skillet, 1 burner. They could be made half asleep in the dark by a woman who had every reason to stop cooking and no ability to let her family go hungry. Speed was not a luxury. Speed was the entire point. Number 7, fried salt herring. Along the Carolina coast and the Chesapeake Bay communities, salt herring was a breakfast staple that has vanished from the American table. The fish came packed in barrels, preserved in so much salt they had to be soaked overnight. Morning, you drained the herring, dredged it in cornmeal, and fried it until the skin turned crispy and the flesh stayed moist and salty. You ate it with grits to balance the salt and cornbread to soak the grease. A whole barrel shared among several families lasted months. Individual fish cost pennies. In the black fishing communities of Beaufort, South Carolina, fried salt herring on Sunday morning was as much a part of church preparation as ironing a white shirt. That smell has not been in most kitchens since the 1970s. Number 6, biscuits and syrup. 2 cups of flour, a tablespoon of lard, a pinch of salt, enough buttermilk to hold. A grandmother who had been making them 50 years did not need a bowl. She made a well in the flour, mixed with her fingers, patted the dough flat, cut circles with a glass, and had biscuits in the oven in 5 minutes. You split one open while it was too hot to hold and poured cane syrup into the middle. The syrup pooled in the soft center and soaked into the bread. A batch of biscuits cost less than 15 cents. A bottle of Alaga cane syrup cost a quarter and lasted a month. For a senior on Social Security, this was not just affordable. The flour was bought in bulk, the lard came from the last hog, and the buttermilk came from the church lady down the road. The syrup was the only purchased item. Number 5, stewed tomatoes over rice. A can of tomatoes, leftover rice, a pinch of sugar, salt. You heated the tomatoes until they broke down, spooned them over rice, and ate with bread on the side. In the Low Country, this was so common, families did not consider it a recipe. Just what you ate when the pantry held canned goods and last night's rice. A can of tomatoes cost 12 cents in 1964. The rice was already cooked, less than 15 cents per person. The soft rice absorbed the tomato liquid until each grain was stained red. Seniors who ate this grew up eating it, and their mothers grew up eating it, and the chain goes back to kitchens where canned tomatoes were a luxury. Nobody put this on a restaurant menu because there was nothing to sell. Too simple, too cheap, too personal to belong anywhere but a kitchen table with a single place setting. Number 4, hoe cakes with molasses. And a hoe cake was a flat cornbread cake fried in a skillet. The name came from field workers who cooked batter on a garden hoe over an open fire. By the 1960s, the hoe was gone, but the name stayed. Cornmeal, water, salt, a little bacon grease. You drop spoonfuls into a hot skillet and flatten them. 3 minutes per side, crispy outside, tender inside, ready for molasses or cane syrup. A batch from 1 cup of cornmeal cost less than 5 cents. In the black farming communities of the Mississippi Delta, hoe cakes were the first solid food a child learned to eat on their own. Small enough for small hands, sturdy enough to survive being dropped. They were also the last breakfast many elderly people ate because they were soft enough for people without teeth and simple enough for people without energy. Number 3, salmon croquettes. And a can of pink salmon, an egg, cracker crumbs, a diced onion, salt and pepper. Mash it together, shape into patties, fry in a skillet until golden outside and moist inside. In 1965, a can of salmon cost 39 cents and made 6 to 8 croquettes, enough for a family of 4 with leftovers. Salmon croquettes appeared on Saturday mornings in black households from Atlanta to Detroit, served with grits and a biscuit. Children who grew up eating them spent their lives trying to recreate the taste. A 1936 recipe from Beatrice Hightower Cates, collected by a black culinary society in Los Angeles, showed black women had been making these for generations. The dish traveled with the Great Migration. Families who moved north brought the recipe in their memories and the cans in their cupboards. Number 2, grits with red-eye gravy. The gravy was not red and was not really gravy. It was the liquid left after frying country ham, deglazed with strong black coffee. The coffee hit the hot pan and sputtered into a thin, dark, salty sauce that made everything it touched taste deeper. You poured it over stone ground grits and watched them absorb it until each spoonful carried the ghost of ham and the bite of coffee. A slice of country ham cost about 35 cents. The coffee was already made. The grits cost pennies. Seniors who grew up in Virginia and the Carolinas made red-eye gravy as a reflex. The ham went in the skillet. The coffee went in after. The grits were already on the stove. Less than 10 minutes, and the kitchen smelled like a smokehouse for the rest of the morning. This was the breakfast that civil rights workers ate before a march. The breakfast that kept the body moving through a day when the body had every reason to stay in bed. Number 1, cornbread and buttermilk. A bowl, a piece of leftover cornbread, a glass of cold buttermilk poured over the top. That was breakfast for more black Southerners in the 1960s than any other meal on this list. You crumbled the cornbread into the buttermilk with your fingers, the way your mother did, the way her mother did, and ate it with a spoon. The cornbread softened in the tangy buttermilk and turned into something between cereal and bread pudding, cold, filling, and sharp enough to wake up your whole mouth. No stove required, no heat, no effort beyond lifting a spoon. Buttermilk cost 25 cents a quart. Cornbread was already on the counter because cornbread was always on the counter. This was not a meal anyone invented. It evolved over centuries, passed from hand to hand, from mother to daughter. It is the simplest food on this list and the most meaningful. A bowl of cornbread and buttermilk is not about flavor. It is about continuity. Sitting at the same table where someone you loved once sat, eating the same food, holding the same spoon. It is the taste of still being connected to people who are gone. Here is my challenge. Make one of these this week. The hoe cakes with molasses, the fried cornmeal mush, the cornbread and buttermilk. Then sit at the table, not the couch. Set a place, eat it slow, because these breakfasts were never about being cheap. They were about getting up in the morning and choosing to live fully in a country that did not always make that easy. Tell me which one you are going to make. I want to know if the salmon croquettes get more love than the cornbread and buttermilk. I want to know if anyone remembers the smell of salt herring at 5 in the morning, because these are not just recipes, they are proof that the simplest food made in the smallest kitchen, eaten alone or together, can still be an act of love. And there is a woman somewhere in your family line who made breakfast from almost nothing and made it taste like something.
Collard green and onion hash gave leafy greens a starring role, turning a traditional dinner side into a savory breakfast companion. Fresh collard greens were sliced thin and quickly sautéed with sweet onions, a little garlic, and a splash of vegetable broth until tender yet vibrant. The result was a smoky, nutrient-rich hash that paired beautifully with eggs, grits, or cornbread. Some families added diced potatoes for extra heartiness, while others seasoned with a pinch of red pepper flakes to wake up the taste buds. This dish reflected a deep appreciation for garden vegetables and the ingenuity of African-American cooks who brought dinner flavors to the morning table. Collard green and onion hash provided iron, vitamins, and a satisfying warmth that lasted through long days. Its quick preparation and bold taste made it a weekday favorite, while its connection to Southern tradition made it feel timeless, proving that breakfast could be as wholesome and flavorful as any evening meal. Cornbread and buttermilk was breakfast born of simplicity and strength. Grandparents crumbled leftover cornbread into bowls, poured cold buttermilk over the top, and stirred until soft and thick. It was tangy, creamy, and filling, the perfect meal when cupboards were bare. The sourness of the buttermilk balanced the sweetness of the bread, making each bite taste new again. It was food that cooled the body in summer, soothed it in winter, and satisfied hunger all year long. No stove, no fuss, just ingredients that were always on hand. It was eaten with a spoon, quiet and steady, often in the same bowls used for supper. There was nothing fancy about it, but it carried the wisdom of generations: never waste, never want. It was a poor person's breakfast, yes, but one made with pride. Some folks added a pinch of salt or a drizzle of syrup, but it never needed more than it had. The clinking of spoons and the sound of quiet chewing told stories of endurance and contentment. In a world that asked for more, this humble meal taught gratitude for what was already there. Fried catfish and cornbread was a breakfast plate that reflected the abundance of rivers and the skill of African-American cooks in the South. Catfish could be caught at little cost, cleaned, coated in cornmeal, and fried crisp in cast-iron skillets. Paired with hot cornbread fresh from the oven, the meal was both hearty and nourishing. It gave workers the energy needed for long days in the fields, and children the strength to get through school without hunger. Families often made it on weekends when fishing provided enough to share with neighbors, turning it into a communal meal. The taste was bold and rustic, with a combination of crunchy fish and soft bread that defined comfort. Though fish is not often associated with breakfast today, fried catfish and cornbread once stood proudly on morning tables. It remains a reflection of resilience and resourcefulness, showing how nature and tradition came together to sustain communities. Molasses biscuits were one of those breakfasts that felt both humble and rich, depending entirely on the memory you brought to the table. The biscuits themselves were simple, mixed from flour, fat, and whatever milk or water could be spared, but it was the molasses brushed over the top that made them special. The dark sweetness soaked into the warm bread, giving each bite a deep flavor that felt like comfort stretching back generations. Grandparents baked these because molasses was cheap, shelf-stable, and full of the kind of sweetness that made children smile even when times were tight. The smell alone could bring the whole household into the kitchen, filling the air with something warm and grounding. Some families served them with butter, letting it melt into every crack, while others ate them plain, enjoying the caramel-like richness all on its own. These biscuits were not fancy, but they tasted like care, like effort, like mornings where love was baked into every crumb. They were the kind of breakfast that lingered in your memory long after the plate was empty, reminding you of kitchens where nothing was wasted and everything was shared. Grapefruit with sugar and a broiled topping was the picture of mid-century sophistication, elegant yet born of practicality. Halved grapefruit was sprinkled with sugar and broiled just long enough for the top to bubble and brown, creating a caramelized glaze that softened the tartness beneath. Served in its own rind with a little spoon, it looked like something from a hotel breakfast tray. Housewives loved it because it felt fancy but cost almost nothing. The heat mellowed the fruit, making it warm and fragrant, the sugar turning into a crisp, golden shell. It was light, refreshing, and surprisingly indulgent for something so simple. For a generation discovering convenience and presentation, this dish was breakfast theater. Grapefruit with sugar was more than fruit. It was optimism, the taste of a new kind of morning when simplicity could still feel special. Some families added a drizzle of honey or a sprinkle of cinnamon for extra warmth, while others topped it with a cherry for flair. It became a symbol of modern homemaking, polished, easy, and delightful to the eye. The broiled grapefruit was as much about beauty as flavor, proof that even the simplest fruit could feel luxurious when given a moment of care. Leftover sweet potato pie filling spread on toast became Thanksgiving morning sweetness that used every bit of holiday preparation. When grandmothers made sweet potato pies for dinner, extra filling often remained in the mixing bowl. Rather than wasted, the spiced sweet potato mixture was spread thick on toasted bread, creating breakfast that tasted like dessert. The filling contained eggs, milk, sugar, and warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, making it nutritious as well as delicious. Children loved this unexpected treat, feeling like they were getting away with eating pie for breakfast. Adults enjoyed the creative repurposing, appreciating how nothing was wasted. The sweet potatoes provided vitamins and fiber while the toast offered substance and texture. This breakfast cost nothing extra since it used ingredients already prepared for the day's feast. Leftover sweet potato pie filling on toast represented the ultimate waste-not wisdom, showing how grandmothers viewed every ingredient as precious. Okra and tomato breakfast stew offered a savory morning alternative that celebrated the summer garden's best. Fresh okra pods were sliced and simmered with ripe tomatoes, onions, and a hint of garlic until the vegetables softened into a flavorful broth. The natural thickening quality of okra gave the stew a gentle body, making it perfect for ladling over warm cornbread. Some families added smoked sausage or a pinch of cayenne for a heartier dish, while others kept it purely vegetarian, letting the vegetables shine. Served steaming hot, it filled the kitchen with a scent both earthy and bright, reminding everyone of harvest days and backyard gardens. Okra and tomato breakfast stew reflected African American traditions of making the most of seasonal produce, proving that breakfast could be savory, sustaining, and deeply tied to the land. It invited families to gather early and savor the simple pleasure of fresh vegetables cooked with care and served with love. Homemade biscuits with cane syrup were a breakfast of pride, born from hands that worked and loved without rest. Grandparents woke early, sifting flour, cutting in lard, and rolling out dough on wooden tables dusted with years of memory. The smell of baking filled the house, the warmth spilling into every room. When the biscuits came out, golden and steaming, the cane syrup waited nearby, thick and dark as molasses. It poured slow, catching the morning light like honey turned to amber. The sweetness mixed with the salt of the biscuit, creating comfort too deep to describe. It was the kind of meal that made you pause before the first bite, because it tasted like home. Every batch told a story, of mothers who made do, of children who grew up strong on simplicity. There was joy in its repetition, in the rhythm of making something real from so little. The meal said, "We might not have much, but we have each other." And that was enough. The sound of the oven door closing, the clink of a butter knife, the hush that followed the first bite, all of it became part of the morning ritual. That biscuit, soft on the inside and crisp at the edge, carried warmth that lasted long after breakfast ended. It was the taste of love baked daily, patient and proud. Chitlin scramble was one of those breakfasts that spoke directly to resourcefulness and resilience. Chitlins, or pig intestines, were cleaned thoroughly, boiled until tender, and then chopped into small pieces. They were folded into scrambled eggs with onions, creating a dish that was both filling and flavorful. The onions added sweetness, the eggs brought balance, and the chitlins gave a richness that turned the plate into something hearty. Though chitlins are often remembered as a holiday food today, many families once ate them regularly because they were inexpensive and ensured that no part of the hog was wasted. For farm workers and laborers, a plate of chitlin scramble gave strength before long hours of work. It was not a fancy breakfast, but it was deeply tied to survival and tradition. The aroma filled kitchens, and though strong, it carried memories of both family gatherings and everyday meals. Chitlin scramble represented more than food. It was heritage served hot on the morning table. Corn fritters with syrup were the morning's golden reward for those who knew how to turn scraps into sweetness. Leftover corn or cornmeal batter was mixed with milk, sugar, and a touch of salt, then spooned into a hot skillet where it puffed and browned into tender cakes. The air filled with the smell of butter and corn, sweet and comforting all at once. Once stacked on a plate, a drizzle of syrup sealed the deal. Sticky, glossy, irresistible. The first bite had a little crisp from the edges and a soft heart that melted on the tongue. Fritters like these were both breakfast and memory, made by grandparents who never threw a thing away. They were perfect with coffee, even better with laughter, and best when shared. No one called them fancy, but they felt that way, proof that love and creativity could make anything shine. Fried salt pork with gravy over toast was Thanksgiving morning protein using preserved meat to create richness families couldn't afford fresh. Salt pork, the preserved fatback that lasted months without refrigeration, was sliced thin and fried until crispy in cast iron skillets. The rendered fat was used to make gravy by adding flour and milk, creating creamy sauce poured over toasted bread. This breakfast provided essential calories and fat, helping families survive cold mornings before central heating. The salt pork was economical because it used pig parts preserved through salting to last through seasons. Grandmothers kept slabs in cool places, slicing off pieces as needed. The gravy stretched the meat to feed larger groups, with toast soaking up every drop. Children learned to appreciate this combination. Adults valued how the breakfast delivered energy without requiring fresh meat purchases. Salt pork with gravy was honest nourishment, proving preserved foods could create satisfaction. Fried fish and grits made weekends feel like a holiday, even when money was short. The fish came from local rivers, catfish, perch, or whiting, caught with care and cleaned at dawn. Grandparents seasoned the fillets with salt, pepper, and cornmeal before dropping them into hot grease. The sizzle filled the air, mingling with laughter and the bubbling sound of grits cooking nearby. Those grits, thick and creamy, waited patiently for the fish to finish. When both came together on the plate, it was magic. Crispy, tender fish resting beside buttery grits that tasted like the earth itself. Sometimes hot sauce joined the mix, or a slice of white bread to catch every crumb. It was a meal of pride and purpose, proof that even poverty could hold celebration. The river provided the food. The kitchen turned it into love. Fried fish and grits were a reminder that wealth wasn't always counted in dollars. It was measured in moments shared around a steaming plate.
That knowledge is not gone. It is waiting in a bag of cornmeal and a jug of buttermilk. You just have to reach for it. Here's what happens when you do. The food tastes different when you understand where it came from.